Most people struggle with their self-esteem far more than they should. And it's not because they're weak or undisciplined or permanently damaged by a horrible childhood. Most people struggle with self-esteem because they don't understand how it actually works. Hi, my name is Nick Wignall. I'm a clinical psychologist, and today I'm going to share with you what self-esteem actually is, where it really comes from, and what the single best way to improve it quickly is. Number one, self-esteem is your reputation with yourself. I like this definition, not because it's the most comprehensive or because it's the most psychologically interesting, but because it's the most helpful. Everyone knows what reputation means and for the most part where it comes from. We admire people who act according to our values, what we think of as right or wrong, especially when it's hard. For example, let's say you're a parent and you have a strong value of playfulness. You're likely, in that case, to admire other parents who are good at being playful and lighthearted with their kids. In other words, their reputation with you will be high. Or let's say you're a business owner and you really value integrity. You're likely, if that's the case, to really admire other business people who are willing, for instance, to sacrifice a little bit of their bottom line in order to act in high integrity ways. Their reputation with you will be strong. Or let's say you're a writer and you strongly value both creativity and business savvy. If that's the case, you're probably going to admire other writers who publish books consistently that both push the creative envelope and that lead to a successful sort of business for the authors. People who do that, other authors who do that, are going to have a high reputation with you. In other words, we all know that other people's reputation with us is the result of behavior aligning with values, especially when it's hard. Well, self-esteem is the exact same process, just applied to ourselves. Our self-esteem is high when we consistently act in a way that aligns with our values, especially when it's hard. Now, we'll talk about the action behavior part of this idea in a second in the next section. But before we do that, we need to talk about the values section quickly. Because if self-esteem is your reputation with yourself, and your reputation with yourself depends on acting in alignment with your values, you're going to have a really hard time doing that if you don't know what your values are. Or even worse, if you blindly just sort of adopt and internalize other people's values. Now, personal values is a really big, potentially complicated topic, but the key idea here in terms of self-esteem is really simple. Knowing your values, what really matters to you, is a prerequisite for healthy self-esteem. Now, if you want to get started discovering and exploring your own personal values, I have a little PDF guide. I call it my Values Discovery Toolkit. And I share some of my favorite really simple exercises and tools you can use to discover your personal values. If you're interested in that, I have a link in the description below where you can download a copy of it for free. Now, while values are absolutely critical for healthy self-esteem, it takes more than just knowing what your values are. However important that is, healthy self-esteem only comes about through consistently acting in a way that aligns with your values. So we're going to talk all about the action behavior part in the next section. Number two, self-esteem comes from your behavior in the present, not the events of your past. Self-esteem involves everything from mood and emotions to thoughts and beliefs to our behaviors and our values. People with low self-esteem often experience more frequent and intense bad moods, for instance. They also tend to have a lot more negative self-talk, like self-criticism or self-judgment, and they frequently get stuck in habits that they know are not healthy for them. And the flip side of this is also true, though. People with higher healthy levels of self-esteem often are much more emotionally resilient. Healthy self-esteem also tends to make self-compassion easier, and it's a much better foundation for healthy, productive habits in general. But here's the thing, just because self-esteem is complicated doesn't mean improving it has to be. See, while all sorts of things influence your self-esteem indirectly, including everything from your genetics that you inherited from your parents, to your early childhood experiences, to your self-talk and your personal values, and a whole lot of stuff in between, these factors only influence your self-esteem indirectly by influencing your behaviors in the present. Let me give you an example to make this real and explain what I mean. Let's say you had a really difficult childhood, maybe because you were bullied frequently at school when you were a kid. As a result, you have this theory that being bullied is the cause of your low self-esteem. This is an understandable, but ultimately, I would say, incomplete explanation of your low self-esteem or your self-esteem issues. In reality, what happened is the bullying led to a set of behaviors or habits on your part. And those habits, which have persisted into the present, those are what's causing the self-esteem issues. So for example, maybe in response to the bullying when you were a kid, you learned to be very deferential and accommodating of what other people want, because this was a way to prevent other people from picking on you or getting mad at you or bullying you. So this habit, we'll call it people pleasing, for instance, while it may have actually helped you when you were a kid to avoid bullying, now that you're in a situation where you're not being bullied anymore, the people pleasing habit is still with you. That habit of people pleasing, not only is it no longer doing its positive function of preventing bullying, but it's actually actively interfering with and causing your self-esteem to stay low. Think about it like this. If your people-pleasing habit causes you to habitually sacrifice or give up on your boundaries, your self-esteem is going to suffer for the very understandable reason that you are regularly saying yes to what other people want and constantly saying no to what you really want, to what you value. So by definition, you are living out of alignment with your values, which is going to lead your self-esteem to suffer. So while bullying may have been the initial trigger for your self-esteem issues back in your childhood, the actual cause of your low self-esteem now is your habit of people-pleasing in the present. Now, at this point, it's worth mentioning a really subtle but important distinction here, and that is that habits and behaviors can be physical, like exercising or saying no to someone's request, but behaviors can also be mental and internal. So, for instance, chronically ruminating on a mistake or a failure from the past, that's a mental habit. Habitually worrying or catastrophizing about the future, another mental habit. Criticizing or judging yourself for mistakes or errors, another mental habit. See, all these habits, they're happening in our head, but they are fundamentally behaviors that we choose to engage in, which means, however difficult, we can get better at not engaging in them, which means that a very powerful way to improve your self-esteem is to figure out what behaviors, especially mental behaviors, are interfering with your self-esteem, and then work to let those behaviors go. Now, as you can imagine, that's quite a project. It's a worthy one, but it's definitely a project. And it can be difficult because those mental behaviors are often tricky to get a handle on because they're so fast and automatic in our head. If you really want to improve your self-esteem quickly, there's one set of behaviors, physical behaviors, that I've found to be by far the most effective and fastest way to improve your self-esteem. Number 3, assertiveness is the fastest way to improve your self-esteem. There are 4 basic styles of communicating. Passive communication is when you inhibit or defer your own wants and needs for fear of upsetting other people. So things like people-pleasing, conflict avoidance, agreeing even though you don't really want to, these are all forms of passive communication. Aggressive communication is when you express yourself in such a way that you are disrespecting the rights of other people, even though you're being honest to yourself. Threatening, demeaning, blackmailing, these are all forms of aggressive communication. Passive-aggressive communication is sort of the worst of both worlds. You're being aggressive, but in such a way as to deny responsibility for it. So, for instance, things like sarcasm, gossiping, gaslighting, these are all types of passive-aggressive communication. Lastly, we have assertive communication. Now, assertive communication is when you are perfectly clear and honest about your own wants and needs, but in a way that is also completely respectful of the rights of other people. So asking for what you really want is a form of assertive communication. Setting boundaries or saying no to what you don't want, or even just expressing an opinion honestly, even though it's unpopular. Those are all forms of assertive communication. Now, regardless of how familiar you were beforehand with these different styles of communication, it's probably pretty obvious to just about anyone listening to this that long-term, what you want in your life is to be surrounded by people who mostly communicate pretty assertively. Because if you think about it, obviously no one wants to be surrounded by people who are primarily aggressive or passive-aggressive in their communication. And then even though people who are primarily passive communicators, they seem nice and easy to get along with superficially, But what happens is when people chronically communicate in an only passive way, they end up really anxious, really resentful, and really stressed out. And people like that are just very hard to be around long term. On the other hand, it is remarkably liberating to be around people who will consistently be honest and always do it in a way that's respectful and kind at the same time. That is, people who communicate assertively. Now, at this point, you're probably wondering, what does all this communication stuff have to do with my self-esteem issues? As it turns out, everything. I want you to try this little thought experiment to see what I mean. Think of 2 or 3 people whom you deeply dislike. I would bet a lot that what is common among these types of people is that they communicate almost entirely in aggressive or passive-aggressive ways. Now, step 2, what I want you to think about is people you like but don't especially admire. I would bet, again, what these people have in common is that they are primarily passive communicators. Finally, you probably guess what this one is. I want you to think of some people whom you deeply admire. And I would bet that a lot of these people share the common trait of being primarily assertive communicators. They are honest and wholehearted in speaking up, saying no to things, and expressing themselves, but they always do it in a way that's really respectful of other people around them. See, underneath these examples is some pretty basic and even obvious psychology. Deep down, nearly everybody wants to be both authentic and kind. These are 2 core human drives that I think just about everybody strongly desires. Of course, we don't always live up to these, God knows, right? And when that's the case, even then, it's not because we don't want to, it's almost always because there's some sort of underlying fear or insecurity that interferes with it. But deep down, it's there. This is what people want to do. And when we encounter people who really act on that, who act authentically as their authentic selves, and who do it in a loving, supportive way, we admire the hell out of those people. So try this one. Think about how you feel in the presence of someone you really admire, and now admire how much more strongly you would feel if that person you admired was you. See, learning to communicate assertively, it's such a powerful way to improve your self-esteem because it's motivated by 2 of the strongest values there are, authenticity and love. So when you start communicating more assertively, even just a tiny bit, even just a little bit, you tap into this incredible reservoir of motivation to act in alignment with your values, which, as we talked about, is the heart of self-esteem. Of course, like values, assertive communication is a pretty big topic, and there's a lot of complexity in it. But the key is to start very, very small. Don't make it more complicated than it needs to be, especially at the beginning. You can become just a little bit more assertive by doing things like maybe you tell your best friend that actually, you know what, I want to get sushi tonight instead of pizza. Just expressing that little opinion and asking for what you want, even though you're a little bit afraid they might get annoyed or upset with you. Or maybe it's telling your spouse or partner tonight that, you know what, instead of watching the chick flick, you want to watch that new thriller spy movie. Or maybe you are sharing a snapshot. You take a little photo with your phone of a recent watercolor painting that you did, and you share it with an old friend because you're proud of it and you want to share it with them, even though you're a little bit nervous about feeling, I don't know, somehow kind of prideful or boastful sharing something you did, but you go ahead and do it anyway. These are all examples of relatively small ways to practice becoming a little bit more assertive. Because remember, assertiveness is about, at its core, showing up for your life wholeheartedly. And when you start doing that, even in very small ways, your self-esteem is bound to rise. Now, if you want to learn more about starting to communicate more assertively and improving your self-esteem as a result, I've put together a little, what I call the assertive communication cheat sheet. It's a little PDF, a short PDF document that's full of my favorite tips and tricks and strategies and reminders for starting to communicate a little bit more assertively. Plus, I answer common questions about assertiveness, boundary setting, stuff like that. So you can get a copy of that for free using the link in the description below. All you need to know. If you want to improve your self-esteem, there are 3 essential things you need to know. Number 1, self-esteem is your reputation with yourself. Number 2, self-esteem comes from your behaviors in the present, not the events of your past. And number 3, assertive communication is the best, fastest way to improve your self-esteem. All right, thanks for watching this video. If you'd like to learn more from me about self-esteem, I have another video that I did recently that I think you'll really enjoy. It's called 4 Habits That Cause Low Self-Esteem, and you can watch it right here.